Good morning and welcome once again. I'm David Inoue. I'm an emeritus faculty member at University of Maryland and a researcher at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our next speaker, Dr. May Berenbaum. She's been a faculty member at the Department of Entomology at the University of Illinois at Champaign since 1980. She's served as the head since 1992, and she's also the Swanland Professor of Entomology since 1996. With a focus on the effects of natural and synthetic chemicals on plant-insect interactions, including pollination, her research has encompassed species in 7 insect orders. As a member of the National Academy of Sciences, she chaired the Committee on the Status of Pollinators in North America that NAPPC had a big role in, and testified before Congress on honeybee health and pollinator decline. She received the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2011 and the National Medal of Science in 2014. And she's here to tell us about the insect apocalypse, loss of biodiversity in the insect world. Welcome, May.
Hi, am I on? Hot mic. Hi, thank you. David neglected to mention he was on that committee, an absolutely essential part with his unequaled, magnificent bibliographic, comprehensive knowledge of all things pollinator. Thank you to NAPPC for inviting me. I have a great deal of admiration and affection for this organization and am honored to speak. And I was asked to speak on a very daunting topic. The insect apocalypse. I've not given this talk before. There's a lot of very small text. We'll see if I can actually get through this without falling off the stage, which will be memorable in the wrong way. So, what exactly is an apocalypse? It's been in the news a lot. It's actually from the Greek word revelation. It is a biblical concept from the book of Daniel, the life of the prophet Daniel, who was rescued from his enemies by, or not, God. And he learned in one of his many visions that Israel would similarly be rescued and that everyone else would be in dire straits. There shall be a time of trouble such as never was a nation even that at that same time. So non-biblically, an apocalypse is a disaster on a cataclysmic scale. And in fact, apocalyptic fiction imagines a sudden catastrophic event that causes the collapse of civilization. Causes can be natural and out of human control, or human and usually the result of evil and greed. A number of apocalyptic novels involve the disappearance of some taxon or other. Death of Grass from 1956 by John Christopher imagined a world with no Poaceae, no members of the grass family, including grain crops, as a result of the mutation of a Chung-Li virus. Hothouse by Brian Aldiss from 1962 imagines all life except for plants disappears, whereupon plants evolve to fill all niches. This happens because Earth gets locked in an orbit constantly facing sunlight and photosynthesis runs amok. The Blight by John Creasy imagines all trees, life without all trees. Powerful international organization aimed at world domination engineers this disaster. And finally, and most relevant today, is a novel called Dust by Charles Pellegrino, the only apocalyptic insect-related novel I know. And the cause of the disappearance of all insect life was natural, intermittent, cyclical extinction events. Here you see it's kind of a cheat in that insects do go extinct, but mites do not, and they evolve to fill all the niches. So, as you can see, the mites become flesh-eating insects, which is a good trick considering they're in a different class. And I did look at the fossil record, and I don't see 33 million years of periodic extinction. So even though there's at least one Amazon reader believes this is based on actual fossil records, I don't think that's the case. Although it's worth pointing out what if we are not the cause and can't do anything to stop it? So we now face, apparently, a real apocalypse. Or do we? If you do a Google search, it's not clear. There are alarming headlines, particularly the New York Times cover story on the insect apocalypse from last November. And many other stories picking up on recent papers, but also stories that cast some doubt as to whether or not there is, in fact, an insect apocalypse of any sort. in particular, there are 3 high-profile papers in the last 2 years that have attracted a lot of attention, both positive and negative. There was a very widely cited paper in 2017 based on a series of malaise trap surveys over a 27-year period throughout Germany, revealing a 75% decline in flying insect biomass. Problems being, biomass is not biodiversity. And sampling was done not in the same place, but over a wide geographic scale, so it does not represent population trends for any given site. There was also a review paper that reported that 40% and over 40% of insects are in decline, heading toward extinction. This was criticized for being a review that was biased, searching only for papers about decline, so not an even-handed review, with a disproportionate emphasis on certain regions globally that aren't necessarily reflective of the distribution of insect abundance. And finally, a study based in Puerto Rico, published in the Proceedings National Academies, that purported to demonstrate with data from 30 years ago a 10 to 60-fold reduction in taxon diversity or abundance, which was criticized, among other things, for failing to take into account effects of hurricanes, succession, and population cycles. Now, the fact that some high-profile publications have been criticized for methodological irregularities or limitations emphasizes the relatively poorly developed state of counting difficult to enumerate insect populations and projecting population trends due to the dearth of historical studies providing a baseline population data, and also the difficulties of documenting declines in animals that naturally have boom and bust cycles. Perhaps the most famous long-term database is that of the size of the overwintering populations of monarch butterflies in Michoacan, Mexico. And even these dramatic data have been subject to different interpretations. Oh, that's supposed to happen. Now, interestingly, when I started looking into insect apocalypses, I was surprised to see this is not our first insect apocalypse. If you do Google Trend Search, this is a feature on Google that lets you go back in time to see internet references. It's a relativistic thing, it's not absolute counts. But you can put in a search term and see how many times in any given year there was a citation, a reference to that phenomenon. I don't know where the pointer is, but see that big spike right at the beginning on the top search, which is insect apocalypse. That's 2004, which kind of took me by surprise. Turns out that 2004 apocalypse was brood 10 cicada emergence, which freaked out everybody in its geographic range because there were cicadas everywhere and interrupting all kinds of activities. But and you can see at the tail end the current resurgent interest in apocalypses. Insect apocalypse is a search term. Down below, the second search is on the bee apocalypse specifically, bees being in trouble. And you can see that spike from 2007, which was associated with colony collapse disorder, about which more later. But bee apocalypse interest has sort of leveled off over recent years. Now, we've had a crisis of biodiversity since 1992, when Edward O. Wilson first used the term in his 1992 book, Diversity of Life, which was 27 years ago. If, in fact, this is an apocalypse, it's a very slow-moving one. So a pollinator crisis in particular has been recognized at least since 1996, when several global organizations got together, particularly the Convention on Biodiversity, to establish an International Pollinator Conservation Initiative. And this continued up through 2000, 2002. More increasing numbers of nations were involved. In 2002, NAPPC approached the National Research Council with a request for funding a study on the status of pollinators in North America. In 2004, that study was approved with USDA, USGS funding. So clearly, NAPPC played an important role in determining if, in fact, there's even the potential for an apocalypse. Now, in 2004 was an interesting year because those long-term databases began to become available and analyzed, and there are several high-profile papers published that year. Conrad et al., for example, reported the findings of 35 years of Rothamsted, England insect survey, which is a network of light traps across Great Britain, of 338 common macro moths. 54% of them, these species displayed significant declines, in contrast with 22% displaying increases. There was another study by Thomas et al. Published, very high profile, in 2004 in Science, compared survey data on butterflies in two relatively close time periods, found that butterfly, using area map distribution maps, found that butterflies across Britain had on average, disappeared from 13% of their previously occupied 10-kilometer square areas between initially 1968-72 and 1995-1999. And in the paper said if insects elsewhere in the world are similarly sensitive, the known global extinction rates of vertebrate and plant species have an unrecorded parallel among the invertebrates, strengthening the hypothesis that the natural world is experiencing a sixth major extinction event. And again, yet another study from Britain expanding beyond moths, looking at bees and syrphid flies, hoverflies, and again showing, documenting the geographical extent of the declines in these taxa, raising the issue of pollinator decline to be a priority for future research, focusing on, among other things, habitat alteration, climate change, agricultural chemical use as potential drivers. These probably all sound familiar because they're much under discussion today, remain under discussion. So what was this new sixth extinction? Well, the Earth has experienced 5 major extinction events, the causes of which, of course, we can't go back in time, are subject to some discussion. Clearly not related to humans because we weren't even here for many of them. So the suggestion is that there is a new event that humans are associated with. And in fact, extinction rates have clearly been accelerating in a diversity of taxa other than insects, the ones that first became obvious. And in extinctions, since 1700, extinction is perhaps the one form of environmental change in which human involvement is essentially impossible to deny. And unlike fiction, cannot be blamed on alien viruses, planetary aberrations, or cyclical geologic disruptions, not in this time frame. All of these factors linked to known extinctions involve human activity. Overharvesting, agricultural activity, urban development, invasion and disease, pollution, system modification such as fire and damming, climate change, human disturbance of many forms, transportation, energy production. This is actually derived from a paper by Durzo, published also in Science. It's worth pointing out that insects very well might be more inclined to suffer at the hands of human activities due to 2 biological characteristics. So this was suggested by Robert Dunn. Extinctions of narrow habitat specialists and co-extinctions of affiliates with the extinctions of their hosts. So both of these forms of extinction are often ignored by conservation programs because they're focused on vertebrates and plants. And these are uniquely insect-related sorts of phenomena. So pollinators can be considered mutualists, so they depend on other organisms, especially, and they're especially vulnerable on islands because they're habitat specialists on top of that. So this was from the National Academy report inventorying some of the known extinctions. At the time, about 70 species of insects are documented to have gone extinct, and a disproportionate number appear to be pollinators. Now, this susceptibility is particularly acute for holometabolous insects, insects with complete development, because larval stages, even as adults, they may not be mutualistically dependent on a narrow range of plant species, but as larvae, particularly in the order Lepidoptera, they are. 90% of Lepidopteran species feed on 3 or fewer plant families, and it's not unusual for Lepidopterans to be dependent entirely on one plant family. Really, the best documented extinctions happen to be, among other things, moths on islands, particularly the Hawaiian island chain, documented extinctions from particularly Laysan. This was from the turn of the century when some, for want of a better phrase, nameless idiot, decided that rabbits would be a great addition to the fauna of Laysan, and they proceeded to absolutely devastate the vegetation. You can see the upper picture is happy groups of nesting birds, many of which had disappeared as a consequence. The birds got a lot of the press, but in fact, the extinction of the birds may have been accelerated by extinction of the insects on which they depend, including moths, like Laysan noctuid moth, for example, a Laysan species on which the Laysan miller bird, now extinct, depended, and it was one that also disappeared. Several of them. Another island moth that is now extinct is this endemic Fiji island zygaenid moth, Heteropandolans, is thought to have gone extinct due to parasitism by a Malaysian tachinid fly introduced to eradicate the coconut moth, which is, you see on the point pin there, which was causing major economic dislocation in Fiji because it attacked coconut, which is a source of copra, which was a major industry. In introducing the non-specific, highly generalized tachinid fly, it also wiped out the confamilial species. Host specificity also leaves continental moth species vulnerable in larval stages. Chestnut bite, fungal pathogen of American chestnut, first detected in the US in 1905, and within 50 years, 80% of American chestnuts were gone, were dead. More than 200 million acres of chestnut were essentially eliminated, and at least 60 species of insects were known to feed on Castanea, and at least 7 were restricted to feeding only on Castanea. Paul Oppler did a survey of about 60 species that known to occur on species in the genus Castanea. Some of them, about half, had hosts in other plant families, but more than 20% had no host plants other than in that family, and about 30% did have records in other genera. 7 were monophagous on the American chestnut, and estimated that may actually have gone extinct since 1978. Sad to report, 2 have been since found, but the other 5 are gone, and you can tell from if you try to find them on Encyclopedia of Life or any other sites, there's not even any images of them to remember them by. So relative to the number of species described, insects don't seem to be at risk, the actual absolute number of insects, but only a minuscule proportion of the total number of known species, which is about 1 million, have been evaluated, particularly relative to birds and mammals. Virtually all known birds and mammals have been evaluated as to their status. The number threatened as a proportion of the species described among insects is less than 0.1%, but of those, a disproportionate number seem to be at risk, from 60 to 75%. So they are likely as vulnerable or more vulnerable, as or more vulnerable than vertebrates. So the Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973 with the stated purpose to conserve imperiled species and the ecosystem upon which they depend, directs the US government to list species as endangered or threatened, and designate critical habitat for species listed and develop recovery plans. The first invertebrate took a while, 3 years, before it was listed. That was the Schaus's swallowtail butterfly, listed in April 1976. 3 more butterflies followed in June. Happy to say the Schaus's swallowtail is still with us. Today, there are about 25 butterflies of 575 North American species, that's 4.3%, that are listed as endangered. 1 moth out of 11,000, that's 0.009% listed as endangered. 1 continental bee species of about 4,000 or 5,000, and 1 continental fly species that are listed. Now that moth, listed in 2000, Manduca blackburni, is a sphingid moth once found throughout the Hawaiian archipelago. It was thought to be extinct until 1984. It was rediscovered. It's restricted now to Maui and the island Hawaii, Big Island. Thought also to be a victim of a biological control program for Manduca sexta, a congener with which it resembles, with which it has a resemblance. Another, this extirpation of the blackburn blackburn sphinx may have been associated with endangerment of a plant species. And this is the alula, sometimes called cabbage on a stick, Brighamia insignis. It's a campanulaceous species, critically endangered endemic species. It's pollinated now only by biologists on cliff sides where it resides in Kauai. Has no known pollinators, but given its floral structure, it was likely pollinated by Manduca blackburni and possibly by the critically endangered fabulous sphinx you see pictured here, which may have gone extinct as well. Although it was rediscovered in 1998. Today, ash trees, genus Fraxinus, are under threat from emerald ash borers, and there's a fear that if ash goes, then more than 20 lepidopterans, including 5 sphingids, may go extinct along with them. Sphingids are excellent pollinators. Now, more than 10 years ago, 2008, a couple of papers appeared bemoaning how difficult it is to engage the public in biodiversity issues. You can't see it, neither can I, but the first paper that came out argued that the media seems to make biodiversity issues more complicated than people can understand, and that messaging has to improve to relate to people why this matters, why this issue matters to everyone individually. In a book chapter edited by Francisco Ayala from a symposium on biodiversity, that the author asked why, after a massive international effort to deal with the biodiversity crisis, has failed to engage people, partly because corporate interests were not signing on, nor were governments at the time. Getting people engaged is considered challenging. And again, Google Trends, do you remember that apocalypse trend? People are more interested in apocalypses than they are in pollinator conservation. You can see the initial interest, particularly around 2007, hasn't really been maintained. I was hoping to see a spike, but I do not see a spike. I do see a spike, however. Save the Bees seems to be a more engaging way of engaging with the public. There is a definite increase in interest. That initial spike is the colony collapse disorder, and now it has accelerated in recent years. So what can we do when surveys routinely report that nearly 90% of Americans are willing to help to save animals from extinction, but are unsure how to help? I will point out not all of those 90% realize that insects are animals. You'll see people often saying animals and birds, for example. And another challenge is how to motivate those who are not already active in environmental issues. This was a study on public knowledge on monarchs and support for butterfly conservation more broadly. And the basic finding is people that are engaged in environmental issues are concerned about pollinator conservation. So the challenge is we have to broaden the educational effort, direct it toward individuals who are not already associated with an environmental organization or predisposed to embrace this issue. Now, for the majority of Americans, doing something to save pollinators might seem like a lot of work. So you go online and you can see 3 ways to boost pollinators, 4 ways you can help pollinators, 5 ways to help, 6 simple ways, 7 easy ways, 8 ways. At the very least, these seem to be time-consuming. Here's 10 ways to protect our pollinators, 12 ways you can help to save the bees, and overwhelming. Here's 20 gardening tips to help bees, 25 easy do-it-yourself ways to help bees. Where do you start? Moreover, some of these are misguided. This is a WikiHow on how to save the bees. So leave beehives alone when you find them. Don't go disturbing the bees or taking their honey or honeycomb. Good luck, because that is a hornet's nest. And hornets actually eat bees. Even creating an action plan sounds complicated. Look, it's 7 steps to create a plan. So here is maybe a radical alternative. Because so many insects are threatened by human activities, we are causing this problem. Maybe declines could be slowed by an inaction plan. Can people be convinced to stop doing things they don't need to be doing that involve time, energy, and economic investment on their part? Insect declines and extinctions, as this textbook example illustration provides, are often due to what things humans do without even realizing that they are harmful. Benign ignorance may be the greatest obstacle to surviving the insect apocalypse. It could be that at least one way to help pollinators is to stop doing things that don't really need to be done. Bug zappers, for example, very few studies. And these are expensive. People buy them, people set them up to attract and kill mosquitoes. The 2 studies have been done, here's just the most recent one. 2 collections made over 6 or 5 nights in 1999, 2002. Biting insects consisted of less than 0.4% in one year and 0.9% in a subsequent year. Non-biting insects, the vast majority of insects that were killed, culicids, mosquitoes, an insignificant fraction, and chironomids, a related family of flies, completely innocuous, very important contributing ecosystem services, massive mortality. Not surprisingly, a lot of moths were killed by bug zappers in these 2 studies, 405 species individuals in 1999, including 62 noctuids, 30 saturniids, and 302 pyralids, all in families that are pollinators. So moth attraction to life is cliche. People should have anticipated this. Another thing, as a general rule, everyone should cut down on using pesticides that serve no economic purpose. This was a study that was released by the Environmental Protection Agency in 2014, basically showing that treating seeds prophylactically with neonicotinoids and or fungicides provides negligible overall benefits to soybean production in most situations. In the American Midwest, a recent paper confirmed this finding across 12 years in 14 soybean-producing states, including Illinois. Data suggests that treating seeds, quote, pre-treated seeds provides little to zero net benefits in most cases, and we know these seed pesticides leach out into the soil, end up being taken up by wildflowers and having many off-site adverse effects. This was out of Purdue. Then there are the lawns. The United States has more acres of lawn turf grass than corn, soybeans, orchards, vineyards, and trees put together, nut trees put together. Per acre, lawns receive more pesticide applications than agricultural land, and you can't even eat what grows. In addition to demanding relatively large investments of time and money for maintenance, lawns are not great for pollinators. A number of studies show that bumblebees and other pollinators are non-target victims of pesticide use on lawns. Yes, you can install a flowering bee lawn. This is, again, from Minnesota. Marla Spivak's involved in designing flowering bee lawns. You do have to install them. That's a big input of effort. But flowering bee lawns require minimal maintenance. That should be appealing, right, to Americans? Not mowing can increase pollinator biodiversity. Here's a study showing reducing urban lawn mowing increases wild bee diversity. Not weeding. People can easily not weed. Pollinators, this is a study from Kentucky, Larson et al. Pollinator assemblages on dandelions and white clover, the targets of most weed eradication efforts in lawns, are fabulous for pollinators. 50 different species of insect pollinators, including 37 species of bees. 2 of the species of bumblebees that were collected in this study are considered uncommon and possibly in decline. So there are covenants against letting your lawn go wild, but there are legal arguments to be made to lift restrictive covenants on lawns, and maybe even a case for federal law protecting, quote, the ability to use private property as a fundamental right. This has worked in this arid Southwest to justify xeriscaping. It's kind of a win-win. Conservatives like the hands-off, no government interference, and liberals would like the fact that it's promoting biodiversity. National polls show great support for conservation of public lands. Even politicians should realize that not changing laws can be as helpful as passing laws, which can be difficult to protect pollinators. For example, not really have time to go into the current administration's effort to vastly reduce the acreage in the Escalante, Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ear monuments in Utah that would basically restrict the area by a staggering proportion. So Bear's Ears has more than 660 species of bees. That's more than the entire eastern seaboard has. And there are great conservation concerns by opening up this area where they are known to exist and persist to uranium mining, off-road vehicles, oil leases, every kind of environmental disruption. All those things we do that cause problems for pollinators. And the administration has lost the first court battle. So save the court battles, just don't change the laws. And not doing things is not going to save pollinators. Clearly, action is still needed, particularly to ensure habitat protection, which is our best buffer against the insect apocalypse. But maybe more people can be recruited to the cause by not doing things to help pollinators. And the concept of not doing anything that's harmful is pretty venerable. It is the guiding ethical principle in medicine. Primum non nocere, first do no harm. Maybe it could work as well for pollinator health. And with that, I thank you.